Welcome to this grand Hobart Town Hall, which, amongst other things, hosted the world's first Greens Party meeting on March the 23rd, 1972. Tonight is the 8th Hobart Oration, brought by our foundation. We've had a galaxy of interesting and learned and entertaining speakers, but none more so than tonight's guest, who is Julian Burnside, and I'll be introducing him in a short while. And along with that, a filmed presentation to us from Behrouz Boochani, who's incarcerated and can't be with us, but a little more about him as we go along as well. It's going to be a great night. I hope you're all warm. I hope you can hear well. And to get us before we get underway, a few thank yous. Firstly, for that welcome music to Emily Shepherd and Andrea Breen. Thank you, Emily and Andrea. We had a subcommittee of our board who've done all the work to get us here tonight and to get our wonderful speaker across Bass Strait to the southern half of Australia. And that's Leanne Minshall, Roland Brown and James Dryborough. So thank you, three. And staff have been working hard on this. They're all with us tonight. Jasmine Wills, Jenny Webber, Samina Kesho, Mandalee Anstis, Kate Godman and our CEO, Stephen Chaffer. Thank you all for as well. We also have with us former Greens leader Christine Milne, and who worked very hard for human rights and continues to do so, and for the environment. And the current spokesperson for matters to do with welcoming everybody to Australia in Senator Nick McKim, who's been to Manus Island on a number of occasions, who knows Behrouz and who's the most prodigious and humane speaker on asylum seekers, for one, we have in the Australian Parliament at the moment. So it's great to have our fellow Tasmanian Senator Nick McKim with us tonight as well. And I also want to thank Tim and Grace for putting up posters around town, as far south as Cygnet, I think, and getting us all aware that tonight was a special night to be at. Well, to get us off tonight, before Julian gets to the microphone, we've got a special treat. It's called Tubby the President. Now, this has nothing to do with Donald. This is a composition by our prodigious, homegrown musical marvel, Michael Kieran Harvey. He's on piano, and with him on the baritone horn, wait till you see that, is Simon Reed. This work, Tubby the President, was originally for tuba and dedicated to the Canadian tuba player Adrian Rumson, who also commissioned it in 2018. And in around 5 minutes, we're going to get a sequence of pieces which together make up Tubby the President. It's all on the back of your programs, ladies and gentlemen. There are seven short pieces. Would you welcome to the stage Michael Kieran Harvey and Simon Reed? Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Kieran Harvey and Simon Reid. Well, Julian, you had to come to Hobart to hear a tribute to our most powerful figure in the world, Donald Trump, like that tonight. There's a little edge of Jimi Hendrix coming through there, but there you go. Well, that's a world premiere performance, by the way, of Tubby the President. I notice in Julian's CV, he's not beyond understanding such music because he did commission a piece about our late Prime Minister, well, he's not late, but former Prime Minister Tony Abbott's own love for renewable energy and wind farms. So we won't get that tonight, but what we do get is Julian Burnside himself, a remarkable Australian, and I won't give you his full CV, except to say I know he's going to be in good, warm-hearted, humane company here in Hobart tonight for the 8th Hobart Oration. Julian grew up in Melbourne. He studied at the Monash University. He went to New Zealand and won the Blackstone Prize for debating. And there, I think the Chief Justice equivalent of suggested to him that he take law, and he did so. And Julian's been practising, he took economics and law, and has practised commercial law ever since. Amongst the glitterati that he represented earlier on were Alan Bond and Miss Porteous, both West Australians, in celebrated cases of the time, which showed his skill at the bar and in representing people from right across the spectrum. But it may well be that taking a case for the Australian Maritime Union before the High Court during the Patrick showdown on the wharves in the late 90s was a real turning point because effectively, although judgments are never clear, effectively it was Julian Burnside that took that to victory in the High Court of Australia. He is also notable for having taken the case of an Indigenous stolen generation person in South Australia, the first successful challenge to a government for a former wrongdoing to an Indigenous Australian, which resulted in a $500,000 payout and has paved the way for the ongoing need to give some monetary, because there is no way of restoring to such people what's been taken from them, but some monetary compensation and recompense for what was done in the name of the Australian people by governments. But of course, he will be prominent in many of our minds for his extraordinary role in what's become known as the Age of Asylum Seeker shame on this country. It's an age in which we've lost during the period of the Howard government, and you don't hear it anymore, the national motto of a fair go. And it was during the Tampa crisis at the start of this century that Julian took on behalf of Civil Liberties Victoria, took a challenge in the courts to defend asylum seekers' rights, and he's been at it ever since. And pro bono have been the two words that have gone with that. He has, instead of being led by the pocket, as most of the world is these days, been led by the heart and taken on serially some extraordinary cases in the Australian courts, but travelled worldwide. And more recently, Julian was just telling me tonight, producing or being the advocate spokesperson, the presenter of Border Politics, a 90-minute film on the global situation for people being squeezed on borders when they're escaping fear and persecution but not being allowed, as world law requires, into a place of safety. This film is showing, will be showing to schools. It'll be coming online. Again, it's called Border Politics, and I've just suggested to Julian tonight that we would love to see it at the State. It's been running for a long time in Sydney to packed houses, and including in a theatre for 800 people. That's just touching the tip of the iceberg. Julian is also, of course, a QC. He has the Order of Australia. He has a big range of accolades, including Australian Treasure. I like that one. And, but I think most appropriately, he's also, a long time ago now, became an early winner of the Humanist of the Year award. A humanist he is, delightful human being he is, and in an age where we need it greatly, a human heart here in our presence tonight to give us his view of the state of the world, the question marks that come with it, but the view that comes from that better side of history, and which we hope won't be long in making its mark in predominating again in a world that sadly needs it at the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Julian Burnside.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all for coming. I live in dread of turning up to give a talk and no one comes. I've altered the title just a little bit. This talk, which I have actually written and which is going to be available somehow or another through the electronic media, is now called Justice for the Next Generation, ? The Collapse of Values. The two great issues, maybe before I start, I should especially acknowledge the presence not only of Bob but also of Christine and of Nick. Nick McKim is doing a sensational job on behalf of refugees, by the way. You should be very proud to have him. And I have to say, this is the first time I've got up to speak publicly after a performance of Donald Trump farting through. One tiny alteration or correction to what Bob said. It's true that I commission music quite often, and the Tony Abbott thing was I commissioned a Sydney composer called Lionel Chan to compose a short piece of music which was to be called Wind Farm Music Dedicated to Tony Abbott. He left office very soon afterwards. And the other slight correction, the New Zealand thing, I was studying law sort of for reasons that I didn't bother going into, but not with any intention of being a lawyer. And because back then at Monash University, mooting, which is like pretend court, not exactly debating, but, you know, like pretend court, it was voluntary and nerds tended to do it, so I gravitated to it. And in a small field, I was chosen to represent Monash with some other people at the Australian New Zealand Law Student Society competition, which that year happened to be in New Zealand. And this was, I think, 1970. I'd not even been to Tasmania at that point, so the idea of a free trip to New Zealand was fairly exciting. And I had sort of vaguely formulated the idea that I wanted to be a management consultant because that was the occupation du jour back then, and I had done an economics degree. And at the drinks function after I won, the Chief Justice of New Zealand, who'd presided over the final moot, said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, well, I think I'm going to be a management consultant. And he said, "You should go to the bar." Now, that was my career planning, you know, not ideal. it occurred to me a couple of years ago it'd be very funny if what he really meant was go and get another glass of wine. The idea that my whole career has been founded on a misunderstanding appeals to me in some odd way. When I sat down to write out some ideas for tonight, it occurred to me that the two great issues that our generation is leaving the next generation are climate change and the treatment of refugees. And I make it very clear that although refugees are the issue which have attracted my attention and caught my activity for a long time, climate change, I think, is the #1 issue facing the world. The treatment of refugees across the world is getting worse and worse, but climate change is the issue which really comes #1. Refugees are a second-order issue, unless you're a refugee, I guess. Both of these are issues which the next generation will have to solve, if they're ever to be solved, and if humanity is to survive and flourish. It's often overlooked that climate change has been known about for a long time. There was Joseph Fourier who worked out that the Earth was so far from the sun that the temperature on Earth couldn't be explained by receiving radiation from the sun alone, and that the Earth's atmosphere must be trapping some of the heat coming from the sun. Later, another scientist called Turnbull worked out that carbon-based gases or carbon-based things in the atmosphere tended to trap infrared radiation. So specifically carbon dioxide, methane, water vapour and so on. And then some years after that, a Swedish scientist called Arrhenius worked out very precisely and very accurately the exact degree or the exact rise in temperature on the Earth for any given increase in the levels of carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere. What we overlook, I mean, these things are now part of contemporary science, but what we overlook is how long ago this was known. Fourier's work was in 1824, 1825. Turnbull was in 1859, and Arrhenius, who really put the lid on the whole thing, was 1896. So for more than a century, we have known exactly the consequences of what we have been doing ever since. And even now, we don't seem capable of changing course. So let's take a moment to see what Australia is doing, or not doing, in relation to climate change. In November 2016, an expert advisory panel reported that coal-fired Queensland, with just 7% of its power generated by alternative energy sources or renewables, they could lift that to 50% by 2030 with virtually no increase in the cost of electricity. The Queensland government would be able to subsidise renewables, but the Federal Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg, criticised the report. We are a uniquely embarrassing case on the global stage. The Gillard government put in place a workable, comprehensive domestic climate policy, which was then torn apart by Tony Abbott. And ever since then, our emissions have risen every year. Malcolm Turnbull has failed to adopt policies any more advanced than those of the troglodyte Tony Abbott, whom he replaced. And Conservative politics in Australia, it seems, will have to be dragged kicking and screaming towards energy sector reform, and that is a job which can only be done by the next generation. So, sorry, young people. To watch Malcolm Turnbull fade into a shadow of what he could have been is watching the slow destruction of a man the country once respected. He seems unable to lead his party on any important issue, and he's capitulated to the hard right sort of intellectual giants like Tony Abbott, Peter Dutton and Eric Abetz. I thought I'd better get into Tasmanian reference. But that's especially so on the issue of climate change, and also refugees, incidentally. So that Australia's reputation globally on climate change has moved from global leader to global threat. Since the world signed the Paris Agreement, some of our achievements are as follows. First, Tony Abbott asked the mining industry to demonstrate its gratitude to the retiring Federal Resources Minister Ian Macfarlane, who dismantled the mining tax. Remember the great big new tax? Okay. Anyway, the industry paid attention to Abbott's plea, and Macfarlane got a $500,000 a year job with the Queensland Resources Council, on top of his $140,000 parliamentary pension, so that he could spruik for the Adani coal mine. And Abbott recently expressed regret that he had signed up Australia to the Paris Agreement in the first place. The government fast-tracked the Adani coal mine in Queensland, one of the biggest coal basins in the world, which, if developed, would blow any chance of the world remaining below the 2 degrees of global warming, which was fastened on in Paris. And it continues to press for the Adani mine to go ahead. It's attacked environmental groups, standing up for the world's climate and trying to protect the natural environment. In May of 2016, it was revealed that the government had censored a United Nations report on the extent of bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef and how much of a role climate change had played in that. In that year, 2016, the Great Barrier Reef got a D on the Australian government's annual report card for the 5th year in a row because of the large-scale bleaching in the northern part of the reef. And there is a threat that it will never recover, although actually that's slightly overstated because we know from history that the world's coral reefs did die once before and they recovered 10,000 years later. That should be encouraging to the operators of tourism in the Great Barrier Reef. Of course, the government had, more recently, the government organised an ideological war on renewable energy after the South Australian blackout, which they managed to blame on renewables, even though the operative cause seemed to be transmission towers that had fallen over. It all culminated in Josh Frydenberg, again, trying to bully the states out of their ambitious renewable energy targets and pushing them instead to focus on promoting onshore gas production. So here comes the fracking. The Australian government actively resisted and watered down restrictions on financing of coal plants by OECD export credit agencies in 2015 because the government wants more coal plants to be built so that there are new markets for Australian coal. And we thought Donald Trump was embarrassing. By exporting our coal, we're exporting our emissions to other countries that we aren't required to take responsibility for under the UN climate commitments. Australia's domestic emissions equate to 1.5 of the world's carbon emissions. That puts us 16th in the world. But if we add the emissions which are generated by the coal that we export, we become the 6th largest emitter in the world. And if Adani goes ahead, well, all bets are off. And this is a time when reports are telling us that if there's any chance of avoiding the safe 2 degrees warming scenario, that no new fossil fuel projects should be allowed to go ahead, and that current ones need to be scaled back. I don't think the Australian government has quite woken up to that position. It's up to us as Australian citizens to lead the way on climate and to make a moral case for climate change leadership, because the very least we can do for the next generation is to make sure that they inherit a world which has at least a chance of survival. But the climate change deniers are still taken seriously on television and in newspapers. I wonder why. Where's the balance of activity in the newspapers? Let's think about that for a moment. Murdoch seems to dominate the ownership of the news. Our independent state-owned broadcasters, the SBS and ABC, are terrified of the government, who, although having promised no cuts, went ahead and cut their budgets. What we need to do is force politicians to accept and understand the precautionary principle. Let's face it, it works out like this, more or less. We know that for quite a long time, about 97% of the world's climate scientists reckon global warming is real, at least in part anthropogenic, and very dangerous. And of course, you tell that to the deniers, and their response will be along the lines, if they're intelligent, which is debatable, their response will be along the lines, scientific truth isn't decided by majority vote. And that is undoubtedly right, as witnessed Galileo. So let's give it odds. There's 80% odds say that the climate scientists are all wrong. Only 20% chance that they're right. But if the 20% comes in, the result is catastrophic, avoidable, and may end civilization as we know it. But a 20% chance of an avoidable catastrophic outcome is worse odds than Russian roulette. So tell the climate change deniers to go and play Russian roulette with their kids and their grandkids. Let's face it, if we spend money avoiding climate change and it turns out that the 20% doesn't come in, the 80% comes in, well, we will have spent a whole lot of money cleaning up the atmosphere. What a pity. That'd be terrible. Now, I want to turn to the other major problem which we will be leaving to the next generation. When I got involved in the refugee issue, as Bob said, through the Tampa litigation, I went into it knowing nothing about refugee policy or refugee law. And at the end of it, I came out knowing some very, very discomforting things about what was going on. And I thought, well, gee, if the public know this stuff, then they will react the same way I'm reacting, and it'll take 6 months to fix it up. That was in 2001. So I'm not politically astute. It opens up the very interesting area of human rights generally, and what is not remembered widely enough these days is that modern human rights thinking is relatively recent. You don't have to go back to the Treaty of Westphalia or anything like that, but at the end of the Second World War, Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, decided that what the world needed was a universal declaration of human rights. And that was her great project. And it was ultimately accepted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, with Doc Everett, an Australian, presiding over the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948. And the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really good. The first 3 paragraphs read, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, and whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law." That's just the first 3 paragraphs of the preamble. And of course, the events which have outraged the conscience of mankind was what was discovered about the German concentration camps. It is often overlooked that Australia played a surprisingly significant role in the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and actually argued for the idea that the rights declared should be enforceable. We've moved a very long way from that position, which is rather sad. But our contribution to it is all the more significant because at the time Australia's population was only about 3.5 million. We were a small, isolated country. And I like to think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a reflection of the sentiment of the times across Australia and across the world. But things changed. it's not widely remembered that the Tampa litigation was decided, the trial was decided by Justice North in the Federal Court of Australia when he handed down his decision in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon on the 11th of September 2001. 8 hours later, the attack on America happened. And if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one bookend of the human rights era, September 11 was the other bookend. All of a sudden, John Howard, who'd been in America on September 11, their time, started calling boat people illegal. And that lie has persisted in the coalition ranks ever since. The Tampa case really marked a very significant change in Australia's attitude to human rights, I think, although Bob, referring to the Trevorrow case in South Australia, a stolen generation case, suggests that our history is a little darker than we like to think. Actually, our history is fascinating. Given that we're so terrified and obsessed by terrorism at the moment, it is interesting to note that the most recent theory about Ned Kelly, a national hero, that he engaged in his activities in order to establish a new state in the northeast corner of Victoria, or a new colony. So by contemporary definitions, Ned Kelly was a terrorist. And the other great episode in our history, which is remembered each December, is the Eureka Stockade Rising, which on any view of things was a terrorist act. So how is it that a terrorist and a terrorist act are two of the most significant things in Australia's history, and we're so frightened now when terrorist events happen in Europe? It's very odd. I should explain, I have all of this is in text. Time won't allow me to go through all of it, so I'm skipping lots and lots of bits. But I think it's very important to remember that the Howard government, remember at the start of 2001, I should say, the Howard government really looked on the edge whether they'd get back or not. And the Tampa episode, which was initiated on, I think, the 26th of August 2001, was Howard's last attempt to garner a bit of support. He could never have expected the luck that he would have with the timing of September 11 in the United States. But the federal election was in November of that year, so just 2 months after September 11, there was a federal election in which John Howard went to the polls with the mantra, "We will decide who comes to the country and the circumstance in which they come." Now, I don't expect that anyone in this room was seduced by that mantra, but if you have friends who were, friends who still think that sort of sums it up pretty well, let them know this. If it's an observation about migration policy, it is absolutely true. If it's an observation about refugee policy, it is absolutely false. The reason is this. I can say, as a homeowner, I can say, I will decide who comes to my home and the circumstance in which they come. And if I'm sick and tired of having people dropping in, I can say, I don't want visitors till Thursday week. It'd be a little bit unfriendly, but it'd be fair enough. What if the next morning a little kid comes up to the door and says, "Please help me, there's a man with a big knife chasing me"? I could say, "Come back on Thursday week," but that would be outrageous. What I would do, what I should do, what we all should do is bring her in, sit her down, check her story, and if she's bullshitting, send her home, and if she's fair income, then protect her. That's what you do. John Howard went to the polls and won with an increased majority in November of 2001 on the basis of a seductive lie. Now, until 2013, boat people would typically arrive at Christmas Island, which is a little speck of Australian sovereignty up in the Indian Ocean. It's roughly 3,000 kilometres from Darwin or Perth. It's a very long way away, but it is a little bit of Australia. And that is typically where asylum seeker boats land, because it's the closest part of Australia to Indonesia. Indonesia has not signed the Refugees Convention, we have. Indonesia can send them home where they would face persecution, we can't, or we've promised the world that we won't. I had an interesting conversation with a doctor who worked with IHMS, International Health and Medical Services, who'd worked on Christmas Island for some time through to the change in policy in 2013. And she said that when boat people arrived, they'd typically come from countries which were landlocked, so they'd never seen the ocean before, let alone travelled on it. They had typically been 7 or 8 days in a very uncomfortable circumstances, typically with not enough to eat or drink, typically with no opportunity to wash or change their clothes, and they typically arrived wearing clothing caked with their own excrement. And the Australian immigration authorities would not allow them to change and wash before interviewing them. Why that little bit of humiliation was needed is anyone's guess. When they arrived, they would be checked if they had any things like false teeth, hearing aids, prosthetic limbs. They would be taken and confiscated and not returned. If they had any medication on them, it would be confiscated and not returned. And the doctor told me that one of the IHMS people had a role of sitting in front of a rubbish bin, popping pills out of blister packs for later destruction. If they had any medical documentation, it was taken and not returned. The doctors had 48 hours within which to decide whether or not a person showed any signs that would contraindicate sending them to offshore detention. There was one woman, she said, who had been kept on Christmas Island for some weeks because she was thought to be psychotic. The trouble is, no one understood what was wrong with her, partly because if she'd had any medication, it had been taken and destroyed. If she had any medical documentation, it had been taken and destroyed. And so this doctor decided to have a long consultation with the woman, and they're sitting opposite each other across a table, but the interpreter who was needed was in Sydney, 4,000 kilometres away. Difficult consultation, but eventually the doctor worked out the woman's problem was that she was incontinent of urine and she couldn't leave her cabin without having urine running down her leg, and that was driving her mad. So the doctor said to immigration, we need incontinence pads. Their initial response was, we don't do those. The doctor insisted, and immigration eventually relented and said, well, she can have 4 a day. Any more than that would be a fire hazard. So that's the way. That's the way we work it. Now, in 2013, the Labor Party, in a scandalous collapse, introduced compulsory offshore processing in circumstances where the people sent to Naru or Manus would not be ever allowed to settle in Australia. So calling it offshore processing was not quite candid, but then they're politicians after all. Now, on the 19th of July was the cut-off date, and it has produced all sorts of very extraordinary results. Results which the next generation are going to have to deal with because there's no obvious way for this to end. The results include this. Sometimes, in their attempt to reach safety, families get broken up. You know, they'll get 2 of them on one boat and the rest on another boat, and if the first boat hits bad trouble or if the engine breaks down, it might have to go back and then they get onto another boat. So there are families where some of the family members arrived in Australia before the 19th of July 2013 and others arrived after the 19th of July 2013. And there are now, on Manus and Naru, people who have got family members living in the community in Australia. People who've been accepted as refugees by us, but the family members have been sent off for offshore processing and no doubt have been accepted as refugees, but they will never be allowed to live in Australia. Our country is deliberately breaking families apart in the same way that Donald Trump has been doing recently. since 19th of July, I'm going to turn to Behrouz Boochani in a minute. I mention that because apparently the technical thing takes a little bit of... Behrouz Boochani is one of the people who's been held on Manus for 5 years, as most of the people in offshore places have been held for over 5 years. It's worth noticing that the way it works at the moment is that anyone who arrives, unaccompanied men get sent to Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea, north of the mainland of Papua New Guinea, almost on the equator. Naru is an independent republic on the equator in the Pacific Ocean. Naru is a very interesting case because Naru is 2 square kilometres smaller than Tullamarine Airport. It's very, very small. Its population is about 9,500 people, and yet we think it's an appropriate place to dump refugees who we don't want. The people who are sent to Naru typically are the unaccompanied women, unaccompanied children, and family groups. Behrouz Boochani, as I say, is held on Manus. He's a Kurd who is a poet and a journalist, and he has managed to write a book, staggeringly, called No Friend But the Mountains. And it's remarkable that he's managed it because he's done it all by texting on his iPhone and sending the text to friends in Australia, and it's been compiled into a book of more than 300 pages. At page 133 he says, "Can it be that I sought asylum in Australia only to be exiled to a place I know nothing about? Clearly they are taking us hostage. We're being made examples to strike fear into others, to scare people so they won't come to Australia." Now, that's pretty important because he has committed no offence. He has the wit to recognise that he's being held hostage to deter other people from trying to get to Australia. And that is one of the most shameful things this country has ever done, but we're doing it all the time, and the coalition is somehow making political capital out of it. Now, I don't know how I think we're about to see Behrouz.
Dear distinguished guests, fighters for freedom and supporters of justice, it is wonderful to share my thoughts with you tonight from here in Manus prison. Thank you to everyone for attending. Your participation is highly appreciated. I wish to extend a special thank you to Dr. Bob Brown and Bob Brown Foundation for giving me this valuable opportunity. The situation on Manus Island and Naru is becoming more disasters every day. There is no way that the Australian government can hide what is doing to innocent people, especially since the siege on Manus prison in November 2017. And our peaceful resistance, the Australian public and people around the world are well aware of the events and details as reported by the media. My talk tonight will focus on the relationship between the writing history and its impact, and also asking what kind of social and political change is realistic. I would like to talk about my philosophy regarding writing as a duty to history, and developing a strategy to address the next generation. Anyone who reads my work and the reports from other journalists and academics will know the extent to which the Australian government has inflicted pain and suffering on the innocent refugees. Children, women, and men have been subject to remarkable cruelty, and the majority of people in Australian society continue to be unmoved. I have been working hard and putting myself at risk to document this injustice. And there are also many witness testimonies and other forms of evidence one can draw from. Since 2013, 12 people have lost their lives on Manus Island and Naru. But justice has not been served. The reality is that this crime may never be investigated in my life. But last year we witnessed something remarkable, and there was a shift in the way the world views the situation here. The closure and forced removal of refugees from Manus prison in Lombrom was a turning point for so many reasons. The circumstances were so extreme and the brutality so intense that the international media and even Australian mainstream media began to take a special interest. From the days leading up to the 31st of October, I began documenting the siege and the surreal horror that began to develop. Not only did we see a shift in media attention, but a number of people went to extreme length to support us, both local Manusian and Australian. One politician visit was symbolic and a special motivating factor. On behalf of all the imprisoned refugees on Manus, I wish to express gratitude towards Senator Nick McKean. He came to support us. He reassured us that we are not forgotten people, and he also participated in our peaceful protest while the PNG military, police and mobile squad were surrounding us. During his visit, we became a unique unit. We were now a team of refugees, Manusians and Australians. Our decisions and our vision were guided by this inspiration and feeling of community. It was a time to imagine a new way of being and a new way of ordering society. This unity has the potential to become a model for a fairer and more compassionate Australia. However, the two major political parties continue to be at war over border security, and it is more than likely that they will continue using the refugees on Manus Island and Naru for their own ambitions. This is what I call a form of ritual sacrifice. And the reality is that recent pro-refugee campaigns and protests, different movements within civil society, and years of work by refugee activists have all been incapable of forcing change within Australia's political system. We must accept the fact that we have failed in many respects, and we must also begin to look inward and ask why it has taken so long to acknowledge our mistakes. There have been many notable achievements, but ultimately the situation continues to get worse, and our methods and tactics have not been able to adapt the incessant violence and secretive political strategies. It is true that we have been able to document the history of this ruthless political ideology and the merciless act of exiling refugees. It is true that these crimes will never be forgotten. We have exposed the history that the government and mainstream media have tried to suppress. We have informed the world about what is happening in these prisons and established these injustices as part of Australia's history. Although we have been successful in writing this important history, refugees are still in prison and maybe for a long time. I do not want to convey a sense of hopelessness, but we need to be realistic and strategic about our activities and organizing. What kind of impact and change can we hope by engaging in advocacy? We have to admit that this generation of Australians will not be moved to pressure the government enough to close the camps and free the refugees. I am so pleased that we are fighting against the silencing strategies of the government and working to document history. The border violence inflicted on refugees must never be forgotten and needs to be acknowledged as a significant part of Australia's history. But what we are doing has not benefited the children, women and men incarcerated in Naru and Manus Island, and it may never benefit them in the foreseeable future. The generation of Australians has been witnessing our torture and struggle and have not been moved enough to demand our freedom. Most people from all parts of the political spectrum have been absorbed into the government's political program to reinforce and replicate the incarceration of refugees. Losing hope, silence, or relinquishing one's duty to human rights are form of failure and moral bankruptcy. As someone who has been struggled to employ any means possible to persuade public perception regarding our situation, I must be realistic about who has the potential to make change within this politicized climate and when. As refugee advocates, how much energy and hope should we invest in this generation of Australians, and how much should we dedicate to preparing the foundation for future generation? What hope is there for the next generation? What work should we be doing to ensure they do not commit the same errors? Admitting the sins of the past is vital for a nation to mature. It hurts me so. It's hard me to say that. Say this, but our hope for change may only be in the hands of future Australians who understand what this generation has done. I have always said that I am writing as a duty to history, but I admit that this notion is problematic. It means that I have lost hope in this generation. I cannot rely on Australians to take a stand and fight for human rights. Writing as a duty to history means that I cannot rely on this generation to pressure the government to adopt a human approach to refugees.
It is significant when you take account of the fact that Behrouz had to record that on his own iPhone. That's why there were those apparent editing cuts. He recorded that on his own iPhone. He's not allowed to come to Australia. It would have been great if we could have had him here today to take part in this conversation, but literate, intelligent, clever and observant though he is, we have said you will never be allowed to live in Australia. The UNHCR recently delivered a report on the state of affairs on Manus. You'll have to read my written paper if you want to see what their report says, but it's sufficient to say at the moment that they're highly critical of the way it is run. In particular, they say they observed high levels of tension and further deterioration in the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers on Manus Island. Why? Well, because we put them there and deprived them of any hope. And it's the lack of hope that probably is the most telling thing. Bob mentioned the film that I've been involved in as a sort of unscripted David Attenborough figure called Border Politics. One of the countries we went to was Jordan. In Jordan, just a few kilometres south of the Syrian border, there is a town called Al-Zatari. In Al-Zatari, there is a refugee camp, not a detention centre, a refugee camp, which allows people to live there freely. When I was there in the middle of last year, there were 80,000 people in the Al-Zatari refugee camp. There were over 1 million refugees living in the community. People have just walked across the border saying, protect us. They're living in the community and allowed to work. The people in the Al-Zatari camp are allowed to work, and some of them have jobs outside. They go outside each day, they come back at night. And because there are so many of them, there are 2,000 shops in the Al-Zatari camp, shops that have been set up by refugees and are run by refugees, including a shop where you can hire bridal gowns. I don't think I've ever experienced a more eloquent demonstration of the survival of hope when compared with what we do to refugees who seek safety here. The UNHCR recommendations include that the Government of Australia should ensure a clear strategy and critical incident response plan that includes significantly bolstered mental health support. We are driving people insane in Manus and also on Naru, and in fact when attempts are made to bring people to Australia for proper mental health treatment, because neither PNG nor Nauru has facilities for that sort of treatment, Peter Dutton, whose salary you pay, Peter Dutton employs lawyers to go along and argue against bringing those people to Australia for the mental health treatment they need. I did a case shortly before Christmas for a girl, 10 years old, held on Manus, sorry, not on Manus, on Nauru. She had started cutting herself, she'd started seriously trying to kill herself, and all of the authorities, independent as well as Nauruan, said she needed proper mental health treatment. She was at serious risk. Counsel for Mr Dutton came along and argued that she shouldn't be brought over to Australia until after there had been a trial of the action. And the judge looked at counsel and said, well, the trouble with that is she may be dead by then. And I'm glad to say the judges do seem to be taking up the slack where our parliamentarians are letting us down. Staying with Manus for the moment, you'll all be familiar with the name Reza Barati. Reza Barati was killed. He was a detainee in Manus Island. He was killed on the 14th of February 2014. Initially, Scott Morrison said that Reza Barati had escaped from the camp and had been killed outside the camp by locals, which was a very interesting observation because it revealed, inadvertently perhaps, that the locals in PNG and also in Nauru are very hostile to the people who are taken there by us. Anyway, it was a lie, and a couple of weeks after Reza Barati was killed, I, along with some other people, received a handwritten, sworn eyewitness statement written by a man called Benham Sattar. Benham Sattar was Reza Barati's roommate in Manus, and the statement included the following observations. Jay, whose name is given in full, is a local who worked for the Salvation Army. He was holding a large wooden stick. It was about 1.5 meters long. It had 2 nails in the wood. The nails were sticking out. When Reza came up the stairs, Jay was at the top of the stairs waiting for him. Jay said, "Fuck you, motherfucker." Jay then swung back behind his shoulder with the stick and took a big swing at Reza, hitting him on top of the head. Jay screamed again at Reza and hit him again on the head. Reza then fell to the floor. I could see a lot of blood coming out of his head, on his forehead, running down his face. He was still alive at this stage. About 10 or 15 guards from G4S came up the stairs. 2 of them were Australians, the rest were PNG locals. I know who they are. I can identify them by their face. They started kicking Reza in his head and in his stomach with their boots. Reza was on the ground trying to defend himself. He put his arms up to cover his head, but they were still kicking. There was one local. I recognised him. He picked up a big rock. He lifted the rock above his head and threw it down hard on top of Reza's head. At this time, Reza passed away. One of the locals came and hit him in his leg very hard, but Reza did not flinch. This is how I know he was dead. After that, as the guards came past him, they kicked his dead body on the ground. A little time after he swore that eyewitness statement, Benham Sattar was taken into the Wilson Security cabin. Remember, Wilson Security, Nauru, Manus, Panama. Wilson Security, they took him into their cabin in the detention centre. They tied him to a chair and beat him up and said if he didn't withdraw his statement, he'd be taken outside the camp where he'd be raped and killed by locals. another inadvertent disclosure that they know the locals are fairly hostile. Several Australians were involved in the killing of Reza Barati, and somehow they managed to leave PNG and return to Australia before being arrested or even questioned. The people who were directly involved in his death were eventually brought to trial 2 years later and somehow managed to escape from jail. Behnam Sattar is still living on Manus, still in fear of his life because he fears retribution. The treatment of boat people offshore is appalling, and I hope you picked up some of that from what Behrouz was saying, and it is our loss that he has to speak to us electronically rather than in person. It's interesting to notice that just, 3 weeks ago, I think, Peter Dutton said something important in response to a suggestion that some people should be brought from Manus to Australia as a matter of compassion. He said this, and this is Peter Dutton, the most powerful minister in this country. He said, "It's essential that people realise that the hard-won success of the last few years could be undone overnight by a single act of compassion." Even 5 years ago, I would not have believed that a senior minister would get away with arguing against compassion. This is the most powerful politician in the country, but he's not invincible. For some years now, I've publicly called Peter Dutton a dishonest hypocrite, and he has not sued me for defamation. I repeat it here and now to all of you. Peter Dutton is a dishonest hypocrite. Dishonest because he calls boat people illegal, which is a lie, and a hypocrite because he claims to be a Christian, and yet what he is doing to innocent human beings contradicts the most fundamental principles of Christian teaching, and now he's arguing against compassion. Let him sue for defamation. Let him bring it on. The defence will be lots of fun. In the tumult of news that we get every day, especially the rich and varied diet provided by Donald Trump, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that a Minister of the Crown has urged us not to act with compassion. He's the same person who recently reduced the social welfare entitlements of people living in the Australian community as they wait for their refugee status to be decided. The government has just cut the SRSS, the Status Resolution Support Service program that provides a basic living allowance and casework support and help in finding accommodation and access to torture and trauma counselling. That's useful. Before the cuts, the SRSS payments amounted to about 89% of the New Start allowance. They were $247 a week. Now, New Start is not exactly the most generous scheme in the world. Surviving on $247 a week, $35 a day, would be unbelievably difficult. In 2016, between the 28th of March and the 2nd of April, Dutton attended a UNHCR high-level meeting on global responsibility sharing through pathways for the admission of Syrian refugees. He claimed expenses of $36,221.80 for those days. That's roughly $8,000 per day. And that's on top of his parliamentary salary, which comes to $949 a day. And since we're talking numbers, keeping refugees offshore is ludicrously expensive. It costs roughly $570,000 per person per year to keep refugees offshore. If they were brought into Australia and told that, and pending status assessment, they would have to live in regional areas, and if they were given, let's suppose, the whole New Start allowance, it would take about 50 years before they cost us as much as they're costing us now every year. Members of the coalition justify this and try to put a moral fig leaf on themselves by saying that they have to do this because they're terribly worried about people drowning at the hands of unscrupulous people smugglers. And they have to deter people from using people smugglers. It's hypocritical and dishonest, and I do not believe one of them for a minute. They're not being sincere or honest when they talk about a concern for people drowning in their attempt to reach safety. Because if they were actually concerned about people drowning, Why do they punish the ones who don't drown? That's a very, very odd thing to do. Instead, they hold them hostage and mistreat them in order to deter other people from daring to come and ask us for help. We are not well served by the present coalition when it comes to human rights generally and treatment of refugees particularly. We're not well served by the Labor Party either, which have never so far contradicted the coalition lies. They've never gone so far as to call boat people illegals, but they've never contradicted the coalition saying it. Bill Shorten, if Labor had a shred of decency, Bill Shorten would make a speech before the next election in which he would tell the nation what we're actually doing. That way, people could decide on the government knowing the facts. Imagine the impact if the Murdoch press reported Shorten saying this. And let me make it clear, these are my words, not Shorten's words. He has not said these words, and I suspect he won't. Men and women of Australia, we are not behaving well. Australia is paying billions of dollars a year to hold people hostage on Naru and Manus. They arrived in Australia seeking to be protected from persecution. Most of them are genuine refugees. Australia took them to Naru or Manus by force against their will. For 17 years, the coalition has called them illegal. They aren't illegal. We should have pointed out that the coalition was lying to you. We didn't. I'm sorry that we didn't. The way we're treating refugees is a betrayal of what Australia stands for. But what does this country stand for? The Statement of National Values, which was introduced by the Turnbull government and is now part of the citizenship ceremony, says in part, I understand Australian society values respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual, freedom of religion, and a spirit of egalitarianism that embraces mutual respect, tolerance, fair play and compassion for those in need and pursuit of the public good. If that's who we are, then what we're doing to refugees is simply un-Australian. It's un-Australian to mistreat innocent people, which we're doing to the people held on Manus and Naru. It is un-Australian to hold innocent people hostage, which we are doing to people held on Manus and Naru. It is un-Australian for political leaders to lie to the public in order to frighten them into tolerating the willful mistreatment of innocent people, but it is what we are doing. If the Turnbull government was honest, it would have included something about cruelty and dishonesty in the Statement of Australian Values. I'm sorry it has taken us so long to tell you truthfully what is being done in your name. Somehow I don't think he's going to make a speech like that. But partly in deference to Bob Brown and the Greens generally, and partly to get a final parting shot at Tony Abbott, I just want to return to the issue of climate change briefly. As a thought to finish on. If the Tony Abbott view of climate change ultimately prevails, then in 8 or 10 generations we will all be history. The collapse of agriculture and of complex supply lines will spell the end for most members of the human race here and across the world. Presumably there'll be some survivors. The Kalahari Bushmen, the Inuit, the Outback Aborigines. So, if the Tony Abbott view of climate change prevails, the Aborigines might get their land back. And I'm not sure that's what he intends. Thank you.
Stay up here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that wonderful? What an extraordinary two human beings to have shared the evening with. And if I could get my camera friend up on stage, one of you please. Would you come up? I just want you to take a picture of the audience. The people who are going to matter in this moment. First of all, I want to give a word of thanks to that great soul who nailed it. He didn't say it was the politicians. He said it was this generation of Australians. We're in a democracy. And it's the people who bear responsibility for the appalling treatment of asylum seekers like this poet, that good soul, this wonderful human being. So I just want you as an audience to be able to express in your own way, in a picture we can send back to Manus and to the friends of Behrouz as well as himself, our gratitude for his strength of soul, his goodness of heart and his example to all of us. He's a Kurdish refugee, the largest Indigenous people on earth with no nation. Being treated like this by one of the oldest democracies on the planet. Well, Behrouz, thank you for your great heart. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Behrouz Boochani for being with us tonight. But then, a word for Julian Burnside, who is with us tonight and who's made all this possible, and who is an inspiration to all of us who do believe in the tenets of the great religions, that you should not cross to the other side of the road when someone is in trouble, but you should go to their aid. And that we should treat all other people as we would have them treat ourselves. And that this ought to be the country of a fair go. Well, Julian, we all live a happier life in sometimes abysmal circumstances when we hear you speaking about how we humans as a national and global institution should care for each other, not least for those we don't understand, who come from a long way away and who we have not heard about their travails in this wealthiest country ever on the face of the planet. You're a true inspiration. You've given us tonight a great deal of food for thought, some great ideas, a wonderful speech for the impending possible next Prime Minister of Australia. But most of all, a great presentation on the goodness which is in the human spirit and in the human soul, and which is the one thing which will get humanity through into the future. Thank you for your inspiration. May